I walked into the office that morning feeling the usual mix of excitement and nerves. 9 a.m., the moment I thought would mark a new chapter in my career, quickly became the moment everything began to unravel. I had spent weeks preparing for this meeting, refining every detail, rehearsing every answer. I thought I was ready. But nothing could have prepared me for the look on my manager's face, the way their eyes scanned me with that familiar mix of impatience and disdain. "You're not what we need," they said, tossing my carefully polished resume onto the desk like it was nothing. The words hit me like a punch, sharp and humiliating. My cheeks burned. I felt the eyes of my colleagues on me, some sympathetic, most smirking. My ideas, my potential, my years of quiet dedication, all ignored, dismissed, reduced to a single, scathing sentence. In that moment, the office didn't feel like a place of work. It felt like a stage, and I was the punchline. I could have slunk away. I could have pretended it didn't matter. But something inside me snapped. I refused to let this be the story of my failure. If they wanted to underestimate me, if they wanted to believe I was replaceable, they were about to get a lesson they would never forget. As I sat back at my desk, I began observing the office differently. The small tensions, the petty rivalries, the cracks in their supposedly perfect workflow, they were all there, waiting for someone to notice. I wasn't going to be invisible anymore. I started making mental notes, cataloging every weakness, every opportunity, every misstep that could be turned into leverage. Every laugh at my expense was fueling me, sharpening my focus. By 10 a.m., I had a plan forming. Not just a plan to get back at them, but a strategy that would completely shift the balance of power. It wasn't about shouting, arguing, or proving them wrong in the moment. That would have been too obvious, too shallow. Real revenge is quiet. Real power comes from patience, from preparation, from striking in a way that leaves your opponent blindsided and wondering what just happened. The office buzzed around me, oblivious. They were so confident in their positions, their hierarchy, their control. They didn't see me. They didn't even notice that while they were busy managing projects and petty disputes, I was already working in the background, connecting the dots, lining up the moves, silently gathering the pieces of my silent takeover. And in that moment, as the clock ticked closer to 11, I realized something exhilarating. They thought they were safe. They thought their empire was untouchable. But empires built on arrogance are always fragile. And today I was about to prove just how fragile theirs really was. By 11 a.m., the humiliation from earlier hadn't faded, it had sharpened into something dangerous. I could feel the weight of every gaze in the office, some still smirking, some curious, all oblivious to the storm quietly brewing. I opened my laptop and stared at the screen. This wasn't just about proving them wrong anymore. It was about showing them that underestimating me had been the gravest mistake of their careers. I started small. A few subtle emails to clients, carefully worded, highlighting opportunities they had overlooked. I didn't make a scene. I didn't announce myself. Every message was calculated, designed to demonstrate competence where my manager had failed, to remind the higher-ups of the value they had overlooked in me. One by one, tiny cracks began to form in their armor. Meanwhile, I observed the office dynamics more closely. I noticed who relied on whom, whose decisions went unquestioned, and whose authority was fragile. My former manager had built a web of assumptions, relying on loyalty and fear, thinking everyone around them would follow blindly. But loyalty is fragile, and fear is only temporary. I made a mental note of the people who could be influenced, the ones who were quietly frustrated, and the ones who were ambitious enough to take a risk. By noon, I had a clear picture of the weaknesses in their workflow. A misfiled document here, a delayed approval there, a neglected client request, all small errors that piled up, unnoticed by anyone but me. I began forwarding the right information to the right people, subtly correcting mistakes, nudging decisions in ways that only I could orchestrate. I wasn't just fixing problems. I was showing that I understood the system better than anyone in that office. Then came the subtle power plays. I initiated a quick strategy proposal in a chat thread with senior staff, disguised as an observation. Noticed a pattern in last quarter's reporting, might be worth reviewing before the afternoon meeting. I typed, keeping the tone casual, almost nonchalant. Within minutes, senior colleagues responded intrigued. They didn't realize the depth of the trap I was setting, the control I was quietly asserting. By 1 p.m., the office energy had shifted. My former manager, completely unaware, was scrambling to catch up on tasks that I had already anticipated. Clients were responding to my emails, praising the clarity and foresight I had provided. Peers who had ignored me were now coming to me for guidance. The invisible network I had built in the morning was turning into a silent takeover. And yet, the true challenge was just beginning. The boardroom meeting scheduled for 3 p.m. loomed over everything. That was where the final confrontation would happen, the stage where I would move from being underestimated to undeniable. Every move I made between now and then was crucial. One mistake, one miscalculated email, and the plan could crumble, but I was ready. Every humiliation, every snide remark, every moment of dismissal had been leading to this. They thought they had power over me at 9 a.m. They had no idea just how fragile their grip really was, or how completely I was about to dismantle it. By 2 p.m., the office had transformed in subtle ways I had orchestrated. The energy was no longer controlled by my former manager, it was quietly shifting toward me. They didn't notice it, of course. They were still preening, convinced that everything was under control, unaware that every step they took was feeding directly into my plan. I watched them from my desk, pretending to be busy with routine tasks while quietly manipulating the flow of information. Every client email I forwarded, every document I corrected, every suggestion I made to colleagues, they thought I was simply trying to stay relevant. They didn't realize I was quietly building influence, turning their own empire against them. And then it happened. A seemingly minor error, a miscalculated report my ex-manager had insisted on submitting, was pointed out by one of the senior executives who had now been subtly nudged by me to pay attention. The room erupted in murmurs. My manager's confident smile faltered as they tried to explain. But the more they spoke, the more the mistakes became obvious. Every lie, every shortcut, every decision made in arrogance was exposed in minutes. I stayed calm, silent, letting the situation unfold exactly as I had planned. The betrayal wasn't mine, it was theirs. Their overconfidence, their dismissiveness, their constant underestimation of me had set the trap perfectly. They were so focused on their own ego, so blind to the subtle maneuvers of someone they had mocked, that they walked straight into the snare I had laid. By now, my former peers were looking at me differently. The quiet assistant, the overlooked team member, they could see that I had been controlling the narrative behind the scenes. Whispers of admiration floated around me, and I felt the first stirrings of satisfaction. The tables had begun to turn, but the final act hadn't come yet. I knew the moment of true betrayal had to be precise. The 3 p.m. boardroom meeting was the stage, but the set had already been laid. I had already infiltrated the critical threads of communication, subtly shifted opinions, and ensured that the right executives were ready to see the cracks my ex-manager could no longer hide. Every action I had taken in the morning and early afternoon had brought us here. The moment my ex-manager realized they had been exposed, it was too late. Their eyes met mine for the briefest second, a mixture of shock and disbelief passing over their face. They hadn't anticipated that the quiet, dismissed employee in the corner had been the one quietly steering the course of events. And in that instant, I knew the power was no longer in their hands. It had quietly, invisibly, and irreversibly shifted to mine. By the time the meeting started, the betrayal was complete. Every senior executive, every client contact, every decision maker I had nudged was ready to follow the new direction. My direction, and my ex-manager, they were already scrambling, realizing that the office they thought they controlled had become my playground. The moment the clock hit 2:15 p.m., everything around me felt strangely quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. The betrayal had already unfolded, but the revenge was a different beast entirely. It required precision. It required timing. And most of all, it required that I stay invisible until the final push. Power gained too early is power wasted. I needed to strike when they least expected it, right when they felt safest. My ex-manager was scrambling. darting from desk to desk, trying to plug the holes that had already sunk their ship. I watched them rush through spreadsheets, blame junior staff, send frantic messages to senior executives, none of which would matter. The wheel was already spinning in a direction they couldn't reverse, while they panicked. I prepared. My laptop became my battlefield. I opened the internal system and pulled up every project my manager claimed credit for. Every document they had signed off on without actually reading. Every client task they had abandoned to chase superficial wins. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was revealing the mess they had created long before today. And with each file, each timestamp, each overlooked mistake, I curated the truth into a clean, devastating narrative. Then I moved on to the strategy deck. The company had been struggling for months, and the board was desperate for a clear direction. My ex-manager had promised one but delivered nothing. I, on the other hand, had been quietly studying every report, every trend, every internal weakness. By 2:25 p.m., I turned all of it into a polished, razor-sharp proposal that addressed every problem they had ignored. Something they could never have imagined coming from me. The unqualified one while I typed. Messages popped up from colleagues asking for help, and I answered each one calmly. Every answer, every suggestion, every solution I offered subtly strengthened the impression that I had been the backbone of the department all along. No exaggeration, no drama. Just competence, quiet, and undeniable. By 2:33 p.m., I began forwarding key documents to the board assistant. Old contracts, revised projections, corrected errors. Not anonymously. Not sneakily. My name was right there. Let them see who was doing the real work. Let them compare it to the chaos my manager had caused. Then came the final setup. At 2:40 p.m., I sent a single email to the board's group thread with the subject line, "Updated strategy insights before the 3 p.m. meeting." I didn't preach. I didn't blame. I didn't even mention my manager. I simply laid out the numbers, the problems, the opportunities, clear, concise, unignorable. The kind of clarity only someone who actually understood the workings of the office could offer. The first reply came in 3 minutes. Then another. Then another. By 2:45 p.m. 3 board members had thanked me directly. By 2:48 p.m. One asked if I could quickly walk them through the thinking behind this. And by 2:51 p.m., the board assistant messaged me privately, "Please join the 3 p.m. meeting. You might be needed." My heartbeat spiked, but not from fear. From the thrill of justice turning into power. Meanwhile, across the room, my ex-manager was still fumbling through their broken narrative, completely unaware that the board had already shifted their focus to me. They thought the meeting would be their stage to defend themselves. They didn't know that I was about to walk into the same room with a strategy they couldn't match, a reputation they couldn't salvage, and an audience already skeptical of them. The revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow, precise, and beautiful. At 2:57 p.m., I stood up from my desk. For the first time all day, my ex-manager noticed me. Their eyes narrowed in confusion. "Where are you going?" they asked. I smiled politely. "Boardroom." Their face dropped, a flicker of dread passing through their expression. And just like that, the power they had held over me at 9 a.m. evaporated. The boardroom, their sanctuary. Their domain was about to become my playground. I walked toward the glass doors, my footsteps steady. The entire office watching as if sensing something monumental was about to happen. And they were right, because at 3 p.m., I wasn't just entering a meeting, I was entering my takeover. The boardroom door felt heavier than usual when I pushed it open, as if it knew this moment wasn't supposed to belong to me. Yet somehow did. The room was already half filled. Senior executives were seated with folders open, laptops glowing, tension humming in the air like a low electrical current. All eyes drifted to me, some curious, some surprised, a few downright confused. After all, I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't part of their inner circle, not until today. I slipped inside quietly, taking a seat along the side wall far from the table, intentionally unthreatening. I didn't need to sit at the table to control the room. Power doesn't always come from where you sit. Sometimes it comes from being the only one who knows what happens next. My ex-manager rushed in seconds later, files spilling from their arms, their face pale and tense. They pretended not to notice me, but their stiff posture betrayed them. They knew something was wrong, deeply wrong. But they didn't know the half of it. The final board member arrived at 3:01 p.m. and the meeting began. "All right," the chairwoman said, clearing her throat. "We received an updated strategy document earlier today. Surprising timing, but extremely insightful. Before we proceed with quarterly concerns, we'll start with that." My manager forced a confident smile, too tight, too rehearsed. "Yes, even though the agenda was set. I took the initiative to prepare." The chairwoman raised a hand, cutting them off. "We're referring to the document sent by." She turned her screen slightly for the others.
Her.
She pointed directly at me. My manager's face drained of color so fast it was almost art. Whispers rippled around the table. Someone frowned. Someone else nodded at me appreciatively. And for the first time, I saw fear in my ex-manager's eyes. They stuttered, trying to recover. "She doesn't have the authority to," one of the board members interrupted, adjusting his glasses as he looked at me. "I'd like to hear her reasoning directly. The projections in her model match issues we've been missing for months." The air tightened. The boardroom didn't even feel like the same room anymore. This wasn't their arena. It was mine. The chairwoman nodded toward me. "Would you mind walking us through your analysis?" It would have been easy to gloat, to smirk, to enjoy the sight of my ex-manager slowly sinking into panic, but I didn't do any of that. I simply stood up. My voice wasn't loud, but it was steady, too steady for someone who had allegedly been rejected at 9 a.m. "I noticed a recurring discrepancy in last quarter's client retention," I began, pulling up the slides I'd prepared in less than an hour. "The issue isn't the product or the clients, it's the alignment of deliverables internally. Here's where the workflow breaks. And here's how we fix it within 30 days. The room fell completely silent. Slide after slide, I walked them through the blind spots, the mismanagement, the financial risks left unaddressed. I didn't attack anyone. I didn't accuse anyone. I wasn't here to throw punches. I was here to show them what real competence looked like. Every question they asked, I answered calmly. Every challenge I countered with data. Every concern I resolved with clarity, all while my ex-manager sat frozen, looking smaller and smaller with each passing minute. At one point, one of the board members turned to them directly. "Why didn't you bring this up earlier?" These issues didn't appear overnight. My manager opened their mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. Nothing came out. They had relied on bluffing for years. But bluffing can't save you when the truth is sitting 3 feet away. Sharp, prepared, and unshakably calm, the chairwoman looked at me again. "Your analysis is exceptionally thorough and intuitive." "Thank you," I said softly, "and to prepare this in a few hours." She leaned back, scrutinizing me with new eyes. That speaks to a level of understanding we apparently overlooked. My manager flinched. The chairwoman continued. "We need someone who can ground this department. Someone who sees the gaps before we fall through them." She paused. I felt the air shift. Everyone did. "Would you be willing," she asked slowly, "to step in as temporary operations lead while we reorganize?" The room went still. Even I froze for a heartbeat. Temporary. Operations lead, a role that reported directly to the board, a position my manager had spent 3 years clawing for. My ex-manager finally snapped, standing abruptly. "This is absurd. She's inexperienced. She's reckless. She was rejected this morning because the chairwoman cut them off sharply. "She was rejected this morning because of your recommendation. And everything we've seen in the last hour tells us you were wrong." My ex-manager's mouth fell open. I watched the realization hit them slow, crushing. Irreversible. This was the collapse of the image they'd built. The unraveling of their authority. The consequence of every arrogant choice they'd ever made. And I hadn't raised my voice once. "I accept," I replied gently, as if the decision were simple. Though inside my heartbeat screamed through my veins, the chairwoman nodded, effective immediately. My ex-manager sat down, defeated, shoulders caved, face hollow. Their empire had crumbled in a single afternoon. And not because I destroyed it, because I simply revealed it. The meeting continued. But everything that mattered had already happened. I was in control. They were powerless. And the boardroom, the room they once dominated, now felt like an extension of my own resolve. By the time the meeting ended at 3:47 p.m., executives lingered to shake my hand, asking for insights, inviting me to future strategy. Sessions. My ex-manager didn't move. Their world didn't just shift. It collapsed, and I walked out of the boardroom with the quiet confidence of someone who had been underestimated for far too long, someone who finally understood the real meaning of power. Not loud, not aggressive. Not cruel, just undeniable. When the boardroom finally emptied, I stayed seated for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. The same room where I had once been dismissed like a nuisance was now the place where my signature had rewritten the company's direction. The walls felt different, lighter, as if they'd been holding their breath for years and were finally allowed to exhale. I stepped out into the hallway, and heads turned. The same people who once avoided eye contact were suddenly standing a little straighter, their expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to respect, maybe even relief. They'd lived under Adrian's chaos longer than I had. They knew exactly why he fell so fast once someone finally pulled the right thread. HR approached me cautiously, like they weren't sure if I remembered their part in my rejection. I did, but I also remembered the terrified look in the assistant's eyes when she whispered, "He does this to everyone." Not everyone was the enemy. Some people were just surviving. So I walked past them without bitterness. My revenge was complete. There was nothing left worth burning. In my new office, still warm from the previous CFO's exit, I ran my fingers across the polished desk. Everything smelled like fresh leather and opportunity, but the real victory wasn't the title, the seat, or the authority. It was the quiet, steady realization that I didn't need approval from people who operated on fear. I didn't need validation from a man who thought power meant intimidation, and I didn't need permission to rise. The board hadn't chosen me out of desperation. They chose me because when everything cracked open, I was the only one standing on solid ground. As I looked out at the skyline, golden, sharp, unbothered, it hit me that this wasn't the end of a war. It was the beginning of a reign I'd built on strategy, not ego. I smiled, knowing Adrian was somewhere pacing, raging, realizing the woman he rejected at 9 a.m. now signed off on his severance package. Some victories are loud. Mine was quiet and absolute. In the days that followed, the office felt strangely calm, like a storm had passed, and everyone was still adjusting to the sunlight. People approached me differently now, not out of fear or flattery, but with a sense of genuine relief. They wanted stability, fairness, someone who understood what it meant to be underestimated and still rise. And slowly, they realized that's exactly who I was. What happened to Adrian spread through the corporate circles faster than any memo. Some said he collapsed under his own ego. Others said he was outplayed by someone he never saw coming. Both versions were true, but the lesson wasn't about power, or rank, or even revenge. It was about what happens when someone tries to block the path of a person who built themselves on discipline, integrity, and clarity. Rejection doesn't break you. It reveals you. And sometimes, it reveals the people who were never meant to sit at the top in the first place. When I signed my first strategic initiative as CFO, I didn't think of Adrian or HR or the boardroom where it all began. I thought of that morning, the cold chair, the dismissive smile, the moment someone tried to shrink me into a version of myself I never agreed to be. If they hadn't rejected me at 9 a.m., I might never have discovered what I was truly capable of by 3 p.m., and that was the real power. Some stories end with applause. Mine ended with a closed door, a silent office, and a truth I learned the hard way, that the world doesn't decide my worth. I do. And maybe that's why rejection never scares me anymore, because now I know exactly what it can turn me into. A threat, a force, a woman who doesn't wait for a seat, she takes the whole
table. This chapter's over, but
the lesson stays with me forever. rejection was the spark, revenge was the fire.